Now we're focusing explicitly on the InsightWorks Advanced Inventory Count module, so this doesn't really help you if you don't have that module, if you're using the standard NAV physical inventory journals. As Brian mentioned, please feel free to ask any questions as we go through the session. All right, so I wanted to get started with talking a little bit about the count process for paper-based counts. And the first step is the type of count you can have. Now, there is technically a third count here that we'll talk about, but really when you're doing paper-based count, we're doing what we call a directed count. In other words, we're going out there and we're generating sheets with a list of items and bins or shelf numbers to direct people to what they need to count. So that's a typical situation, right? You go in, if you're using or if you have used the NAV physical inventory journal in the past, you'll calculate inventory, it'll give you a list of items, you print out the count sheets, people go fill in the quantities and hand it in. Well, that's a directed count. There is something we call a non-directed count where you just go in and you can basically write down everything you find, hand it in, and somebody can type that in. That's not that typical for paper-based, way too much data entry. But it is very similar to the tag-based, where now if anybody does tag-based counts, just maybe put a note in the chat box, and I'll talk more about tag-based counts as we go through. But a tag-based count is where you actually have tags that you put on the items, a two-part tag, and you hand one half of the tag in, the other half stays on the item to indicate it was counted, and somebody enters that tag. So we do have support for that as well, but I'm not going to really cover that in this session. If you do want to use that method for counting, or you currently do that, and you need additional help, let us know and we can help you with that. But for now, we're going to cover off the directed count in the system. So the basic process when we're doing that directed count, we define the count sheets, and a count sheet is just a place where we're going to store that inventory count, or that list of items that we need to count. So then we generate the count sheet lines, which a count sheet line is really an item that we need to count, an item and bin combination, or an item and a shelf number. Then, the employees go out with their clipboards and they write in all the count information, hand that in, and then the people in the office data enter all of that information into the system. And if the employees out in the warehouse or the shop found additional items, they can handwrite that in, and then the data entry people can just add those items onto the count sheet. Okay, so that's the counting. We have a sheet of paper, we write down the quantities, we hand it in, somebody types that in. Once all of that information is in the system, then we need to go and validate that count. We need to run the discrepancy report, see what the variations are, the variances were, that sort of thing. So there's a couple of ways we can do that, but the count difference report will tell us where our discrepancies were. Where are we? We can do the recount sheets. So if you've noticed that there's a lot of variances, a lot of discrepancies when you run that report, you can go in there and generate recount sheets to spit out another sheet of paper that has a subset of the items that you want people to go and double check. Once we've done all that, generated the recount, corrected the data, all of that sort of thing, we move all of that, all of the variances over to the standard NAV journals, where we actually post those entries from the NAV journal. So, the accounting people can post, the warehouse people do the count, and then the accounting people actually post the journals, if you like, or whatever sort of degree of separation you want there. Okay, so that's the basic overview of how we execute on a paper-based count. Now, to talk a little bit about how we get that set up, let's look at the components of that count module. So the main one is the inventory count card, and really that's where we manage the count from. And we typically have one count card per location. Now, you can have multiple locations for a single inventory count card. And where you would do that is, if you have various virtual locations in your physical location, for example, I have a scrap location code within NAV or return to vendor or something like that, I can count that at the same time I count the main stocking location. And where that can help is with reconciliation. So I could see, maybe I've got, I'm short 100 in my main stocking location, but I've got an extra 100 in my scrap location. Well, that shows up on the same report, so it makes it a little easier to reconcile than if I have a separate count for scrap and a separate count for my main stocking location. But generally speaking, you have one inventory count card per location. On that count card, we have something called a count sheet. An account sheet is something that holds the items we're going to count, and those are called count lines. So on the count sheet, we have a number of lines. Each line is an item and bin combination if you use bins, otherwise it's a shelf number. And then there's the inventory count setup that you can use to set some basic parameters like which count sheet report you want to print and you know, a little bit on the count sheet generation and those sorts of things. Most people typically don't have to ever open this inventory count setup, but if you want to change which report prints for the count sheets, you can do it there. All right. Now, one of the key tools in the count module is this inventory as of date. So unlike standard nav, we don't freeze the inventory when you generate a count sheet. And again, generating a count sheet means going out and getting a list of items to count for that particular sheet. And that sheet could be a team of people. It could be, you know, Joe in shipping counts this area and Fred counts that area, whatever you want to, you know, however you want to organize those sheets and those names. When we generate that sheet, we don't lock the inventory. In other words, if you have your inventory at the end of December, you can start planning that and building up those count sheets weeks in advance. And it doesn't lock that expected quantity at that point in time. What it does is it compares when we do the reconciliation and any of the posting or anything like that. It uses this inventory as of date to control which transactions we look at. So if I set my inventory as of date to December 31st, and then I post a transaction on January 2nd, that transaction I post on the 2nd won't be included in any way on this count, okay? So that's very useful when we're doing paper-based counts because there typically is a lot of prep time to get your count sheets right and everything else. And, you know, you can do that in advance and just set your inventory as of date to sometime in the future. Now, if you do use that inventory as of date and you prep your count sheets in advance, one thing you'd do is you'd go in and you do recalculate differences when you start your count. And, you know, if I generated my count sheets, you know, December 1st, that'll bring in all the inventory from December 1st. When I go to count, I want to bring in the latest values for all that inventory. So I'll recalculate the differences and it'll update with the inventory values as of the inventory as of date, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about those count sheets. So generating the count sheet. In your case, when you're doing paper-based counts, it's really always going to be directed, right? Unless you do a tag-based count or a non-directed count, you're going to generate the count sheets. So 99% of the time, you're going to go in there and you're going to have to generate a list of items for people to count. And you can also generate a baseline sheet, a master sheet, to identify things that you may have missed. So when you set up your count sheets, you might set up, okay, I've got 5 teams of people counting, and you want to segregate them into different areas of the warehouse. Well, what might happen when you set up those filters and everything else, you may miss some items that should have shown up on count sheets, but you inadvertently filtered those out. Well, a master sheet will make sure you don't miss anything. It's a baseline sheet. In the case of paper-based counts, though, the uncounted parts report is another option. We'll talk about that in a sec, which will just identify any things that you've missed that you've inadvertently filtered out when you set up your count sheets. Okay. Now, when I say, you know, filtered out, what we have on the count sheets are something called, well, it's just filters, really, NAV filters. So you can filter, there's 2 ways you filter. One is on the count sheet itself. You can specify things like a bin or shelf number that you want to filter on, those types of things. And then it'll restrict every item on that count sheet to match those filters. And then when we generate the sheets, we can decide things like, do we want to include things that are in stock and those types of things. So the count sheets themselves have filters, and then when we generate the count sheets, we have some additional filtering capability. So let me show you what that looks like, because by now you're probably confused.
Hey, Mark, I've got a couple of questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Joe's got a couple. First one is the date driven by posting date or date entry date?
No, so there's a posting date that you specify when you go to post, when you transfer to the journals, you specify the posting date there. So let me open up a count card and I'll answer the other question. So this as of date, so you notice I created this inventory count November 1st. So I'm going to go up and build all my count sheets and everything else. But all of the reconciliation and posting is going to be done as if I'd done this all on December 31st. Okay, so I can pre-plan all these sheets and it's actually going to do the reconciliation and everything as of this date. But when I actually move that to the journals, I could specify January 1st as my posting date if I want. So there is an independent posting date from this as well.
Okay, great. Right. Yeah, the second question actually relates to the recording the presentation. We are recording this presentation. We'll make it available to people so you can review it afterwards. You can go to different spots in the presentation and look at the details.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so when I open up this count card, this is what we've got. You know, we give it a name, we give it the default location. This location here we can override on the count sheet itself. So again, if I had a scrap, I could have another sheet just for the scrap location or whatever. Whether it's active or not, the as of date, you know, we talked about that a lot, and a few other things, statistics and all that kind of stuff. But down here is sort of the meat of it, where I specify the count sheets that I want to create. So in this case, I've created 2 count sheets. I've got 2 teams of people doing the count, and you can have as many of these guys as you like. But I've set up 2. And what I've done is I've come in and I've said team 1 is going to count, you know, everything that's in bin SO1, and team 2 is going to count everything else, right? So the rest of the warehouse. And if I had done something like, you know, SO2 star, in a case like this, if I generate the count sheets, well, I have a whole bunch of different bins here that I've missed that I haven't generated. And so anything that's not on a count sheet won't get adjusted. So if I don't count it, if it's not on a count sheet, it's not going to get adjusted out. So in fact, what I'm going to do, if I leave it like this, I'm going to generate count sheets that are missing items. And I'll talk about how we address that with the master sheet or with the uncounted parts report. But for now, I'm going to go back into this mode here. So I've filtered on bin code, but that's just one of the filters. If you don't have bins mandatory in your environment, you don't have to use that. You could use a shelf number filter on the SKU or item. You can filter by item number and a number of various filters here, including ABC codes, all that kind of stuff. And if you want to filter on something that's not in these sort of standard fields, you can come in here and filter on anything that's on the item card or SKU, basically. So for example, if I wanted to come in and say, you know, team 1 that I'm on this team 1 line, team 1, I want them to only count items for a specific vendor. I can come in here and then just, you know, find the vendor number and, you know, choose a vendor that I want them to count for, put whatever filter I like in that particular thing. So you can go in and do things like that, have multiple entries there.
Mark?
Yep.
A question, are locations required to use the count cards? Some people don't use locations.
No, locations are not required.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Now, from a underlying NAV configuration perspective, it's usually best practices to have at least one location defined that's your sort of default location, but you know, that's sort of irrelevant to this. But yes, you could leave the location blank and have a count for a blank location as well if you want. Okay. All right. So I set up my filters. I'm going to just get rid of this. Once I've got my filters set up, so I've organized this count. I'm doing this particular count by bin, but I could have broken up that count by various things, like maybe have small parts, maybe have finished goods, those sorts of things. You could break it up that way as well. Once I've done that, once I've set all my filters, I want to generate the sheets that we're going to print out and give to the people that are doing the count. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the generate count sheets. And here I have a number of other options I can set to further restrict what shows up on these count sheets. So the first one is include inventory. So you almost always want that. What that will do is anything that NAV thinks is in stock is going to show up on a count sheet. And then the second one here, this empty bins activity period, that allows me to specify whether I want empty bins to show up on the count sheet. So if I have bin mandatory, and let's say I have one item that can live in 3 different bins, and one of those bins is empty, this controls whether that bin shows up on the count sheet or not. So if I put something like 5D there for 5 days, that means that if that bin has been empty for 5 days or less, it will show up on the count sheet for somebody to go on and double check and count what's in that particular bin. If it's been empty for longer than that time period, it won't show up on the count sheet and people won't be directed to go and double check that particular bin. Active items is anything that's not in stock but has had a transaction within whatever period you specify here. So I'm using 5 years because the Cronus database I use doesn't have a lot of data, but you would normally do something like 1 week or something like that. So yes, NAV doesn't think I have any in stock, but since I've had a recent transaction on it, maybe 1 week or 1 month, I still want people to go and count it and double check that it's not actually there. Okay. All right. And then inactive items we can just ignore. There's a few other options for cycle counting and things like that, but for full physical count, I basically set this, hit OK. It yells at me because I've already got existing count sheet lines that I've generated previously. So I just say yes to ignore that warning. And what it'll do is it'll go out and it generates exactly the same lines as last time. And if I click on this, I can actually drill down and see all the items the team 1 is supposed to count. And I can open up, the team 2 sheet and see the items they're supposed to count. Okay. So it looks like there might be another question there, Brian.
Nope, we're good right now.
Okay. All right. So that's the basics of how you set up the count. I come in, I create the count, I indicate the location code, the as of date, and then I can mess around with this to figure out, where people have to count or what they have to count, those sorts of things. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the item tracking. So anybody using lot numbers and serial numbers, you're likely going to have to count those. There's a lot of ways you can set up lot numbers and serial numbers in NAV. First is optional item tracking. I'm going to go through these a little bit. The first one is optional, which means we don't actually need a serial number on whatever transactions you've said you don't need a serial number for. All right, so that's non-specific. And then we can have item tracking with bins, not mandatory. So you don't have bins, you don't have a location even set up, but you have serial numbers and lot numbers. Then you're going to have non-warehouse item tracking with bins mandatory, a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, I won't get into it. But all of these different combinations are handled differently by NAV and handled differently by the count module. So one of the questions we often get is, where are my lot and serial numbers? So you generate these sheets and you've got something that's maybe serialized, needs a serial number, but the count sheet shows a quantity of 20 on one line and it doesn't break out the serial numbers for you automatically. Okay, that happens. And the reason is, unless it meets one of these top 2 criteria, you're not going to see individual lot numbers and serial numbers on the count lines. So you have to have item tracking enabled and not have bin mandatory. So in other words, you've got 10 serial numbers somewhere in the warehouse, there's no bins defined. We can generate 10 lines for, 1 line for each serial number. The other one is you've got warehouse item tracking enabled with bins. So we know exactly which serial numbers are in which bins. And so the reason we don't generate those lines is because if you take that example where you have bins turned on, and I've got an item that can live in 3 bins, and I've got 10 in stock, so 10 serial numbers, we don't know which serial numbers go into which bin. So we'd have to generate, 30 lines for that item. We'd have to generate, serial numbers for the first bin, serial numbers for the second bin, serial numbers for the third bin. So that gets very unwieldy over, if you have a lot of items, right? So we can't really show you those serial numbers. So what you have to do is, when you go to count, you would have to manually write in those serial numbers because we don't know what they are or where they are. So again, these first 2, that'll get you the serial numbers that you can, just check off, or, if it's lot numbers, write in the quantity per lot. If you don't have either of these 2 on and you are tracking lot numbers and serial numbers, you're going to have to manually write in those lot numbers and serial numbers. All right, so executing the count. So once you've got the count sheets set up, you've got all the lines and everything done, you've generated your sheets, what you'll do is you'll print out those count sheets for the people to use. I won't talk about tags right now, but you could also generate tags. There's, you'd have to do a custom tag report to print out the tags or whatever you do. But we typically print out the count sheets for people to handwrite in the quantities that they found. When you do that, you have the option to print out count sheets individually or in bulk. So typically you would print all count sheets all at once. And the reason is it'll tell you it'll be page 1 of 300. And auditors want to see that it's one of 300, not just page 1, page 2, page 3. So you'd normally print out all the sheets all at once. And when you do that, you'd also want to manually sort by the bin or the shelf number if you're using those, so that it's not sorted by item by default. So depending on whether you use bin numbers or shelf numbers, you may want to adjust that sort order when you actually print that count sheet. I'll show you how that works in a second. Now, once the count is done, they've handwritten everything in. They'd hand the sheets of paper into the office, and the people will type that information in. I'll talk a little bit about quick entry when we go into the screen, how that works, but that's just a standard NAV capability. On the sheets, we print out blank sheets of paper where people can write in anything they find that wasn't on their sheet, and the people in the office can actually type those in, like add lines to the count sheet and everything else. Now, one comment here that we see sometimes, I got a count sheet, it says, find 10 in bin A1. Well, there were none in A1, but I found 10 in bin, B1. So I just crossed out A1 and wrote in B1, and the person doing the data entry does the same thing. Well, that's not going to work because now we've eliminated what, the count sheet doesn't see what was supposed to be in bin A1, and it doesn't actually adjust that out. So you'll end up messing your inventory up. So what you want to do is treat that like unexpected quantity. So you found 0 in A1, you manually enter a new line for bin B1. Okay, so don't change the bin code. You have that ability to do it. That's more from a cycle count perspective. You have the ability to change the bin code on the count sheet lines, but don't do that. Okay. Now, another way you can do data entry on this, instead of handing out paper-based count sheets, you can actually use a little scanner like this thing here in this guy's hand, and you could actually scan into a tablet or a laptop. So if you have your products barcoded, but you don't have, the Warehouse Insight product or scanners, mobile computers on the shop floor, you could use something like this and scan directly into NAV. And I'll show you a brief demo of how that works as well. We have a lot of retail customers that do that, right? They have these little scanners and they walk around with a laptop in the store and they scan everything in instead of printing a count sheet. Okay, that said, let's go ahead and look at how this all works. So I've generated these count sheets already. I've gone in here, generate sheets. You saw how that worked. Now what I'm going to do is print them out for people to write their quantities in. The report that's used, there's a couple that come with the system. You set that in the inventory count setup. You can choose which report you want. So if you want to create a custom report or something like that, you can do it. But what I can do is I can filter to a specific sheet. But like I said, you generally want to print them all at the same time. And the sort order, you'll want to do it by bin code or shelf number or whatever if you have that enabled. Okay. In this location, I do have bins, so I'm actually going to sort by bin code so we can see what that looks like. And then when I hit preview, you get what you kind of expect. You get a count sheet that tells me these are the bins I need to look at. Here's where I type in the quantity or write in the quantity and that sort of thing. So again, if you want to customize this to show additional information, those types of things, you can go to town, but this is sort of the standard one that comes with the system. Now, this page 2 here, this is a blank sheet where they can write stuff in. If they find something that wasn't on their printed count sheet, they can handwrite that in, for the person in the office to manually enter that. Okay, and the number of these blank sheets that are produced is determined on this count sheet configuration here. You see this blank sheet quantity. That's how I can specify how many blank sheets I want to print out. Okay, so if you're in an area where, you don't really know what's there, you're not using bins and it's a part of the warehouse, you don't really know what's going to be there, you might want to print out more blank sheets than one. Okay, but that's basically it. And again, it tells me page 3 of 4, so I know exactly how many sheets there are and that sort of thing. And this is what the employees get. They write in the quantities and then they hand the sheet in. Now, from a data entry perspective, an employee would come in, somebody hands in the sheet, they sort it by bin code if that's how the sheets were printed, and they simply come in and they enter the quantities that the person, recorded. Now that one I skipped, and I skipped it for a reason. Let's say they counted 0. I actually want to type in, 0, because what we've got, and I actually don't have it visible here, but what we've got is we've got the user ID of who did the data entry, okay? And so if they don't enter a quantity there, we don't track, it shows up as being an uncounted line. So it basically says nobody actually counted this product. So what we want to do is on zeros, we also want to enter a zero quantity, and then we know that somebody's actually counted that.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah.
Joe's just asking if the description field, is the description field the same width as the description fields in NAV?
Yes. So this description here is just coming out of, the NAV description 1 and description 2. So this is actually a concatenated version of description 1 and description 2, I believe. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. So yeah, that's just the item description that comes in.
Okay.
There is also a comment field if you want to write comments on here, like on that count sheet, there's a place for notes. If somebody wants to enter a comment, you can make that visible. So there's a number of things you can make visible here for analysis and those sorts of things, or remove, like if you don't use variant codes or serial numbers or lot numbers, you can remove all of that stuff if you don't care about it. Okay. All right, now that's the basic data entry. Somebody hands in a sheet and I just go down the sheet with a ruler and type in what's on the sheet. If they've handwritten something in, again, I can come in and I can manually type that in. And, well, here's where quick entry comes into play, by the way. So quick entry allows me to skip over fields I don't care about. So in this case, I entered LS2, and then when I hit enter, it can jump over all the fields I don't care about and take me directly to quantity, right? In this case, I do care about bin code, but that's what you would use quick entry for, is to jump over fields you don't care about. And I'll show you a quick thing here in a sec how we can use that. For most of the data entry, though, you're just going to basically walk down here and type in the quantities, and away you go. You notice there's also a shelf number field. If you didn't have bins enabled, you can do exactly the same thing with shelf number. I could have sorted by shelf number or whatever you want to use. Okay. All right. So that's basic data entry. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to go to a different inventory count here. This is one that I don't have any bins enabled, and I'm going to call this scan count or something like that. So what I'm doing with this is maybe I have a retail area in my shop, and I'm just going to send people out with a laptop to go and scan everything they find in that retail area, or maybe I have a certain set of products in a cage that have barcodes on them or whatever. So this would be useful if I have barcodes on the products. And what I can do is I can go in there, and now it starts out blank because I haven't generated the sheet. I've told them, go out into the showroom and scan everything that you find in the showroom. So what they do is they take their laptop or a tablet, they walk out there with one of those little USB scanners, and they simply scan the barcode that they find on the product. So I scan one there, and you'll notice I scan that and it jumped me right over the quantity. I enter the quantity, I hit enter, and then I scan the next product I find, enter the quantity, and away I go. So this is an easy way of doing inventory counts for items that you have barcoded without having to have, the full-blown warehouse management solution like Warehouse Insight. So is there a question, Brian?
Yeah, there is. Will the program let you enter an item number that is not in the item master?
No, it will not. So if I enter an invalid item, it's going to yell at me. Now, one thing it does let you do, and I think I have this on the slide later, even if you don't have bins enabled in your system, I can still use this bin code to track where I've counted something. So if I have to do a recount, well, how the heck do I know where I counted this LS120? Like I don't have a location code set up or whatever, or I have a location with no bins. Where did I actually count this item? Well, I have two choices. I can enter the shelf number, or I could just manually enter a bin code here. So I could either enter it as a shelf number or a bin code. And this allows me now to go in and say, okay, well, I need to recount this LS120. Where was that actually counted? Well, it was counted at this bin or this shelf. This bin doesn't have to exist in NAV. I don't have to have bin mandatory or anything turned on. I can manually enter that there. Okay. But yes, items have to exist. Serial numbers and lot numbers don't have to exist. Items and variants have to exist, but the rest, and I guess units of measure have to exist. But the rest of this, you can enter whatever you find. Okay. All right. So that was a little bit on the data entry. That scanner stuff is kind of handy, again, if you've got barcoded items. Otherwise, fairly straightforward. Employee hands in their sheet. Person in the office just walks down this column and enters what's written on the sheet. Anything at the back page that they've handwritten, they just type in, and we've done our data entry. Okay. All right. Now that we've done that data entry, the next thing to do is figure out, did we do a good job or not? So reconciling an account. So there's two ways to look at the discrepancies, the variances on the count sheets. One is the line level difference. And what that does is per line, it shows me what the discrepancy was. Now that's not all that useful. You see this expected quantity, there's some rules for how that's generated. But let's say I'm in a situation where I don't have bins mandatory, or I don't have a location specified or something like that. Well, that expected quantity is going to be the on-hand quantity. But if I've counted that item in 3 different places, I'm going to have 3 different count lines for it. So let's say I have 100 in stock and Joe counted 10. Well, on that line, the difference is going to be 90. But Fred counted 50 and Bill counted 40. So in total, I'm good, but on a line-by-line basis, I'm not. Okay, so the line level differences can be useful, but they're not really the best choice for doing a holistic view of what your discrepancies are. So really what you want to do, and I'll show you that, I'll show you this line level difference stuff in a sec as well. But really what you want to do is run the difference analysis report. So there's a count difference analysis report and a count difference summary page that you can use to get a total of everything you counted. It'll sum everything up. So again, if Joe counted 10 and Fred counted 20, it'll sum that up and say I've got a total of 30 and tell you what the discrepancies are based on that. And the count difference summary page you can actually export out to Excel. So let's actually have a look at that. So I've done all my data entry, right? I've entered, I didn't enter any of Teams 2 information. So what's going to happen is it's going to look like Team 2 went out and counted nothing, or, you know, they counted all zeros. We couldn't find any of this stuff, but I'll enter a few here. And actually, maybe I'll enter one that's a little crazy, 100 of those. Now, those line level differences, like I said, if we look at this, the expected quantity is 89. And that 89 applies to this item and bin. If I didn't have bins enabled, this 89 would be my total inventory in the system. And so on a line-by-line basis, you can see what the expected quantity and what the differences are, but it may not be representative in the entire count. You can actually go in there, and there is a field called total count quantity that'll show you a sum of everything you've counted. Okay, so that can be useful as well. But these line level differences are okay, especially for serial numbers and lot numbers, because it'll give you the difference by serial number or lot number. But really what you want to do is run this count difference analysis report. And when I do that, the default is I come in, I show inventory, and I'm going to sort by the variance amount. And when I hit preview, what it's going to do is give me a high-level overview of where all my discrepancies are. Okay, so, you know, if you've got 10,000 or 20,000 items, that might take a minute to run or something like that, but you know, it's reasonably quick. And here it's telling me, you know, wow, I'm short 150,000 of this. I'm short a lot of stuff. This is a bad count. But it will give me an absolute difference. So for example, if the second line I was over by 100,000, it would still show up second because it's the total difference, not just negative or positive. Sorry, Brian, is there a question?
Couple questions. Are the barcode rules used when scanning with a dumb handset?
No. So when we're scanning with a dumb handset, it's just whatever is in that barcode is going to get dumped into that item number field. And if that's happens to be a cross-reference or some weird barcode, it's going to error out. Now, we have done for some people where we've, you know, added logic to intercept that and use the barcode rules if they're available, or to do some custom logic. By default, it won't.
Okay, second question from Arlene. When you are entering the quantities off the sheet into NAV, is there an easy way to validate your total to make sure you entered the quantities correctly?
Well, you can. The discrepancy report is going to tell you if there's something wrong. But when you're transcribing something from paper, there's really nothing that's going to tell you. The only thing you could do potentially is put that expected quantity field beside the quantity. And, you know, if there is a discrepancy, maybe that's enough to trigger somebody just double check that they typed in the number right. So you could potentially go in and say, you know, I want my expected quantity right up here beside my quantity, or put the difference up there, or whatever you like. And then if they're typing it in, you know, it's a common problem when we're transcribing from paper, it's always an issue. So if I typed in 2 and I glance at my screen and the expected quantity is 75, that might force me to look at the piece of paper again to make sure I'm typing in at the right spot. Okay, so that's really about the only thing I could suggest for sort of a validation process.
Okay, thanks. Those are all the questions right now.
Okay, all right. So back to the difference analysis report. So when I run it, I have a number of different options here. I can show descriptions, details, which tells me where it was counted and who counted it, those types of things, or who entered it. And I can show the serial number and lot number differences here as well. So if I turn that on, it'll tell me if I've got extra serial numbers or extra lot numbers, those types of things. And you know, I can reconcile by lot number or serial number. But I'm just going to run this again because I added a whole bunch of stuff. So here we can see this first one, I'm up by 263,000, and then I'm short on all these others. So when I get to the bottom, what it'll do is it'll give me a total difference. So the total difference, just a sum of all these discrepancies, is 660,000. But my absolute differences are significantly higher. So this is actually, that absolute difference is actually the one you want to look at from, you know, an accuracy perspective. So, you know, for example, let's say I've got, you know, $10,000 worth of parts in stock and I counted 0, but a completely unrelated part, I found a whole bunch and I counted it and added up to $10,000. So the net difference is 0. I lost 10,000 of inventory somewhere, but I found an extra 10,000 somewhere else. Well, that doesn't mean you had a good, you know, your inventory was good. Your inventory was pretty bad. It was actually out by $20,000. I was short 10,000 on one and over 10,000 on the other. And that's what this total absolute differences does for you. It gives you your variation within that count, right? How much you were actually out versus what the total adjustment is going to be to the GL. Now, on that note, these values here that show up, this is at the average cost. So this is at the unit cost from the item card. Or SKU. Well, it's actually the item card for sure. So that's the unit cost from the item card. And the reason I mention that is when we copy this to the journals, the total that shows up on the physical inventory journal may be different from this total because it'll use standard cost, or it'll, you know, a negative adjustment will get applied to something that's at a lower cost than average or whatever. So this is really a guide for the people doing the inventory count as to what the variation is. When we copy it to the journals, we'll get the final amount that's actually going to hit the GL. Okay, so some people often ask about this and say, hey, when we ran this report, it said we're up by $1,000, but when I copied it to the journals, it said 5,000. It's usually not thousands of dollars, it's usually hundreds or something like that, but that's why. Okay, the journal uses more specific logic to figure out what the adjustment is going to be. This is just using the average cost. Okay, enough of that. Now, the other one we can use is this count difference summary to look at the discrepancies. And it runs the same logic, but it shows it in a page view. And the nice thing about this is we can actually export this out to Excel if you want to do additional analysis, those sorts of things. And you notice on this one, I click on it, and we can see all the serial numbers that have issues. So this is telling me I'm short each of these serial numbers. And if I counted a serial number that, you know, NAV didn't know about, it would show up as an extra serial number in here. And if you want to see all of these sort of on the same line, we can turn on this group by item tracking. And now it will basically give me that list. If I export this to Excel, I can pivot table on all of this and I can see exactly what's going on and scroll through here and see what lot numbers and serial numbers I have discrepancies on. Okay. So those are the two ways we do the reconciliation. Count difference analysis, count summary. Again, you could look at the line level differences as a quick guide, but these are the two that are going to give you your overall view of what's going on. Now, once we've done that difference analysis, you may want to go in and do recounts. So there's a couple ways you can do recounts. You can write stuff on a Post-it note and give it to the guy, and they go recount it. You come back to the original count sheet and you change the quantity. That works just fine. The only issue with that is you don't really get an audit trail or a history of what was counted other than what's on paper. So what you have the ability to do is generate a recount sheet. So I can create a specific recount sheet and add all the items I want to recount onto that sheet, print it out, and then they've got a list of items that they have to go and find. So it's It's easier than writing things down or using a highlighter and marking up an original count sheet for recounts. They get one sheet that's got all the things they need to go and double check. The other advantage of it is it doesn't allow anybody to modify the original count quantity. So it gives me an audit trail of my original count and then my recount. And I can do recounts on top of recounts. All right. So if you have auditors coming in for your inventory counts, that's huge because now you can actually show the progression of the count. And if people want to do spot checks, like an auditor says, hey, I want you to go double check these 5 items, you can very easily generate a recount sheet for that spot check and track that audit trail of what happened. So let's actually have a look at how you do recounts. So there's 2 ways. One is I could come in here and I could use this generate recount sheets function. And when I do that, I can come in and say, you know what? Well, actually, first I want to add it to a recount sheet. So I'm going to create a recount sheet for myself here. I'm going to call it Recount 1 for fun because it's my first recount sheet. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, you know, all the discrepancies you find that are out by, let's say, more than $5,000 or that are out by more than 5%, automatically add that to a recount sheet for me. So what that's going to do is it's by item number. It's going to sum up all the discrepancies by item number, compare it to these thresholds, and if it exceeds these thresholds, plus or minus, it's going to throw it on this recount sheet. Or if I want to do it line by line, I can do it line by line. So if I choose this, an individual line has to exceed these thresholds before it gets added to the recount sheet. Okay, so I'd set this up, hit preview, it shows me what it's going to be added to the recount sheet and adds it as well if I've got this checkbox turned on. The other way to do it, like I said, if an auditor comes in and says, hey, I want you to spot check, you know, these 3 items, I can highlight those 3 items on here or however many items I want, manually copy it over to a recount sheet. So I'll choose Recount 1. And now what that means is if I come back in here and I want to modify this, I can't. I can't change this count quantity because it's been added to a recount sheet. So what I'd actually have to do is I've created that recount sheet. I would then find Joe or Fred, whoever, and I would say, you know what, you're going to go out and do the recounts. So I print out the recount sheet. Here's everything they need to recount. They go find it, they type in the quantities, and then it's just another count sheet to me. They drop off that recount sheet. I come in here. This expected quantity is now the original count quantity that, you know, they'd originally counted. But let's say it wasn't 300, it was actually 30, and I wrote an extra 0 or something, and so on and so forth. So it's exactly like any other count sheet. I just type in those quantities, but it ties it back to the original count. So now, as an example, I'll just grab this guy, and we'll have a look at the count difference analysis just for that item number. So I'll go in and I'm going to show details this time. And when I filter to that specific item number, we'll see team 1 originally counted it. They counted 300. We expected 75. We did a recount. We actually found 30. And up here, this difference quantity is the rolled up difference. So we're actually short 35 because we expected 75. Our only recount says we had 30. So that's, you know, that's our bottom line number is we're short 45. But here's all the details of what happened. We counted 300. We sent out a recount. They counted 30. It's still way out. We can now do a recount on top of this recount, and maybe they'll come up with the right number eventually. Okay, so that's the recount. It's a very powerful tool, especially if you have auditors. But just as much if on a paper-based count, you know, I see it all the time. People have 300 sheets of paper, and they're flipping through it and highlighting items to go recount. It's very painful. Using this capability makes it way easier to manage your recounts and track what's going on in the inventory count. Okay, so very worthwhile using. All right, now posting. So once we've done all of that, we've generated the count sheets, we've gone out, counted them, people have typed it in, we've done recounts, whatever. We now need to actually, you know, post the variances into NAV. And the way we do that is we set up some posting options on the inventory count card. And I'll go through these here now, and then we copy the count to the journals. So the first thing we do, or the first option on here is the set item tracking lines. If you're using serial numbers or lot numbers and you turn this on, it's going to copy your serial numbers and lot numbers that you counted to the journals. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's going to copy the discrepancies to the journals. So for example, if I had 80 lot numbers in stock and I counted 60, well, it's not going to copy the 60 I counted, it's going to copy the 20 I didn't count because it's going to do a negative adjustment, and it's going to negative adjust those lot numbers out of stock. Okay, so that's what this does. If you have serial numbers and lot numbers turned on, then you want to use this. Now we'll talk a little bit about specific versus non-specific, but in a sec, because that doesn't always do what you'd expect depending on how you have the serial numbers and lot numbers set up. We'll talk about that in a bit. Batch document numbers, basically you want this off. If you have it on, it's going to use whatever number series you have on the batch, but really, and if you have it off, it's going to use the inventory count number for the document number on your item ledger and physical inventory ledger entries. So that's what you want, because then you can track it back to that specific inventory count card. So basically leave that off. Post zero differences. So let's say you count something, you're supposed to have 10 in stock, you counted 10, there's no discrepancy. This controls whether we post a zero quantity entry to the physical inventory ledger entries. So there's no harm in turning this on. I generally recommend it unless you have hundreds of thousands of items with zero quantities, which we had recently. A client actually generated count sheets with a bunch of variants and ended up with about 800,000 lines with zero differences, and tried copying that to the journal and everything else, and it was very slow. On the plus side, we know this thing works with about 1 million records worth of data, but it's a little slow. But if you've got 100,000 items or something like that, and there's 60,000 differences, there's probably no harm in turning this on, or 60,000 items without differences. Anyway, all it does is create a physical ledger entry that shows you counted it, even though there are no discrepancies. Update next count period. This is more for cycle counting. If you're using cycle counting, you would typically turn this on, because then it sets a bunch of fields for cycle counting that you can use going forward for managing that cycle count. And the last one, if you want to override the dimensions that NAV puts on there by default, there's a dimension field that you can set additional dimensions. Like a lot of people have a specific dimension code they use when they're doing physical inventories. You can set that dimension, and then you can decide whether you want to also use the default NAV dimensions or not. Okay. Now, once we've set all that up, and those, by the way, what you saw on the screen there, those are all the default values when you first create a count. Once you've done all that, what we do is we copy the count to the journals, and it'll copy to the journals that you have defined on the posting tab. And there's really actually 4 journals listed there, but there's 3 we care about. The physical inventory journal, so it'll always put something on the physical inventory journal if there's discrepancies. The warehouse physical inventory journal is used only if you use directed put away and pick, okay, where you actually have to use the warehouse physical inventory journal. And the reclass journal, if you have that set item tracking lines, it will use a reclass journal as well. And what it uses the reclass journal for is, let's say I've got 10 of lot number 1 in stock as far as NAV is concerned, but I actually count 10 of lot number 2. Well, for that particular item, there's a zero quantity difference. I counted the right quantity, I just counted a different lot number. So on the physical inventory journal, we'll have a zero quantity. We won't, but there's still a lot difference. So what it'll do is it'll create a reclass journal to turn lot 1 into lot 2. Even though there's a zero quantity difference, the reclass will change that lot number or serial number accordingly. Okay. Now, speaking of lot numbers and serial numbers, if you don't have specific tracking turned on your items for lot or serial numbers, then counting lot or serial numbers is pointless. And if you do count them and you have the set item tracking lines turned on, what ends up on the journal may not be at all what you expect. And the reason is, when you don't have specific tracking turned on, NAV doesn't track what's in stock as far as serial numbers and lot numbers go. So even though I might have to record a serial number when I receive it and when I ship it and everything else, it doesn't work. I could buy serial number 1 and buy serial number 2, and then I sell serial number 2. Well, it'll actually take serial number 1 out of stock because it's not specific. It doesn't match up that serial number. Okay, so counting serial numbers and lot numbers when you don't have specific tracking turned on is pointless. If you do it anyway and you have the set item tracking lines turned on, you may not get the results on the item tracking lines you expect, but again, you don't care because NAV doesn't care. Okay. All right. Now, once we copy everything over to the journal, we're actually going to use a test report to figure out what's going on with that journal before we post it. So there is an enhanced test report. When you go into the inventory count setup, it'll ask you if you want to turn it on, and you do. And I'll show you how that works, because what it does is it actually shows you the errors on that journal before you post it. So it can save you a ton of time before you go ahead and post that stuff. Okay, so let's actually have a look at how we copy things to journals here. That's not coming up. There we go. Okay, so what we do, if I open up, we'll do this count here since I entered some data related here. So what we do, we've again done the analysis, we've done the recounts, everything else. Now we're ready to go. What we do is we actually copy the count to the journals. And what it's going to do is it's going to use the journals that I've defined in here. Okay, so this particular location is not a directed put away and pick location, so I don't need to specify the warehouse physical inventory journal. If you do have directed pick and put away turned on, you would enter this here, and we still populate this batch and we populate the physical inventory journal. So if you have directed pick and put away turned on, right now what you do is you use the warehouse physical inventory journal, you do all your stuff there, then you go into the item journal and you calculate warehouse adjustments. You don't do that with this count module. You would simply go in, you'd post the warehouse physical inventory journal, and then you'd post the physical inventory journal. Okay, but in this particular case, I don't have that warehouse physical inventory journal required. So when I copy the count to the journals, what it will do is it opens up this screen here. It basically pulls in all the defaults from the inventory count, and I can override some of these if I like. Normally you would just leave it as is, but here's where you would specify an alternate posting date. So let's say I wanted this to be January 1st and instead of December 31st, I could set the posting date there independent of the difference analysis date. And that's basically it. So I come in here, I might change the posting date, but I'm going to leave that. And what it does, it's going to yell at me because I've already got lines on the physical inventory journal. I'm just going to say yes, override those. And it's going to go through and it copies everything over and asks me if I want to deactivate this count, which basically just turns off this active flag, which means I can't mess with the count anymore. Now, if we actually look at what it did on that journal, so if I come in here and look at this journal, here's everything that it calculated, including serial numbers and lot number adjustments that it needs to make, and that's basically it, right? So I've copied everything in the journal. Now accounting or whoever comes in and takes over, and what they'll do is they'll run this test report first. And what the test report does is it's a standard NAV test report for the most part, does the same thing, but we have these two additional options. Well, these four additional options here, but the two that are important are the show error messages and show the lines with errors. So if I just run this the way it is, what it will do is just like a standard NAV test report, down at the bottom, it gives me the total that it's going to adjust in inventory. So this is actually the adjustment that this journal is going to make. But you'll notice on this item here, this 80100, it says this item is blocked. Well, if I try and post this batch right now the way it is, it's going to get almost to the end and then it's going to fail because we've got a blocked item. And I'm going to fix that item and I'm going to post again, and with any luck, there's no other blocked items on this. So it's the most horrible thing when you're posting a 10,000 line batch and you get to line number 9,500 and it blows up because I had a blocked item or I had some other error on this batch. And then I fix that and then I post again, and then line number 9,600 fails. And at that point, you're throwing your computer out the window. So what this allows you to do is, again, come in, run that test report, look at everything that's going to prevent this batch from posting, fix that up, and then do the posting. So the accounting people or whoever's posting these batches are going to, it's a must-have. They have to have that in order to do this in a timely manner. But once I posted that, come in after I've done the test report, I post, it's normal NAV posting, it does everything you'd expect, and the count is done.